June 11th, 1920, New York City. A wealthy man is found dying in his own home, shot in the head while sitting in his chair, dressed only in silk pajamas. No weapon, no witnesses, no sound of a gunshot. Within hours, police would discover something even stranger. The victim wasn't wearing his false teeth or his toupee. He never let anyone see him that way. So who did this? And how did they get in? This is the story of Joseph Bowne Elwell, a case that stumped the NYPD for over a century. A murder so baffling that the district attorney himself called it the mystery case of the century. Let's go back to where it all began. On the evening of June 10th, 1920, Joseph Bowne Elwell arrived at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York City. He was heading to the rooftop restaurant on the 15th floor. He left his top hat in the cloakroom and joined his friends at a table near the dance floor. It was 8 p.m. He was having dinner with William and Selma Lewison, Selma's sister Viola Krause, and a journalist from Buenos Aires named Octavio Figueroa. Now here's something interesting. Viola Krause's divorce had just become final that very day. And about an hour into dinner, they noticed someone at a nearby table. Viola's ex-husband, Victor von Schlegel, sitting with a woman named Ellie Hope Anderson. She was dressed in black. Small world, right? But at that moment, nobody thought much of it. They were there to celebrate, to enjoy the evening. At 46 years old, Elwell had done remarkably well for himself. He started out as just a teenager, working as a clerk for an insurance firm. Nothing glamorous. But then something changed. While attending services at the Tompkins Avenue Congregational Church, he convinced the pastor to set up a young men's club. They organized whist drives, events where people would gather to play whist, a popular card game from the 18th and 19th centuries. That's where Elwell discovered his talent, a real talent. People started calling him the Wizard of Whist. He learned bridge whist and began playing for money. Soon he was spending more time at card tables than selling insurance. He and his wife Helen came up with an idea. Why not teach wealthy people how to play? And it worked. Elwell began tutoring people in high society, many of them women, and writing instructional books like Elwell on Bridge. The money started flowing in. He invested in racehorses and property in Palm Beach, Florida. He became somewhat of a ladies' man. In 1916, he and Helen separated. Their 15-year-old son, Richard, went to live with his mother. By 1920, Elwell was a wealthy man. He owned a yacht, 5 cars, and a stable of more than 20 racehorses. He was a successful speculator with money to spare. But there was one thing he wanted: a divorce. Several weeks before that evening at the Ritz-Carlton, he made his estranged wife an offer. He'd increase her allowance from $200 to $350 if she agreed to the divorce. He also promised to make generous provisions for their son. Helen hadn't replied yet. After dinner and dancing at the rooftop restaurant, Elwell left the Lewison party at about 11 p.m. He went to the New Amsterdam Theater to buy tickets for all 5 of them, tickets to Ziegfeld's Midnight Frolic. His friends joined him before the curtain went up at 11:30. They watched the show together. When it ended around 1:45 a.m., the Lewisons, Krause, and Figueroa climbed into a taxi in front of the theater. They made plans to meet again later that afternoon. And Elwell, he headed home by himself. That was the last time they'd see him alive. Elwell lived in a 4-story house with a granite front. It was one of 8 houses built in a row on West 70th Street. The layout was straightforward. Inside the front doors, there was a vestibule about 4 feet long. It led to a glass-paneled door that opened onto the main hallway. The drawing room was on the right, just 8 feet from that inner door. Here's an interesting detail. If you stood in the hallway, you could see the entire interior of the drawing room through a long mirror positioned over an open fireplace. Elwell had a routine. He usually arrived home around 1 a.m., woke up around 8:30 a.m., and ate breakfast. Then he'd visit his broker to check on his stock transactions. He didn't typically eat his other meals at home. unless women friends came to visit. And just before going to bed each night, he had a ritual. He'd remove his false teeth and his toupee. Always. He was self-conscious about his appearance and never let anyone see him without them. That night was no different. He wasn't expecting visitors at that late hour. At about 6:30 a.m., milkman Yost Otten climbed up the front steps of Elwell's house. He tried the double doors. They were unlocked. He opened them and dropped off a pint of milk and a half pint of cream inside the vestibule. Then he pulled the door closed behind him and continued on his delivery rounds. Nothing unusual, just another morning. Nearly an hour later, at approximately 7:25 a.m., the mailman arrived. He usually shoved the envelopes under the storm door, but that morning it wasn't locked. So he tossed about 4 letters inside the vestibule and closed the inner door. He rang the bell twice to indicate that he'd left mail. Still, nothing seemed out of place. When Elwell's housekeeper, Marie Larson, arrived at about 8:35 a.m., both doors, the storm door and the inside door, were locked. She took out her key and let herself in. She stepped into the vestibule, closed the doors behind her, and walked down the hall to the kitchen with the milk and cream. Elwell was usually still sleeping at that hour. She took off her wraps and headed back toward the drawing room to tidy up before he woke and requested breakfast. But as she approached the room, she realized something was wrong. She wasn't alone. Normally, Elwell didn't wake until after she'd arrived. The previous morning, when she came to work at 8:30, he'd been sitting in his armchair reading the mail and newspapers. He was wearing black slippers and a black and purple house coat over red silk pajamas. This time was different. Elwell was sitting in an upholstered chair, barefoot, dressed only in his red silk pajamas. Larson apologized for intruding, but he didn't reply. Then she saw the blood. He was bleeding from a bullet wound to the forehead. The back of his chair was pressed against the wall. His chin rested on his chest while the back of his head was wedged between the top of the chair and the wall. A bullet protruded from the scattered plaster about 3 inches above his head. Both of his arms rested on the sides of the chair. A partly open letter from horse trainer Lloyd Gentry lay on his lap. Drops of blood from his wound had landed on the letter. The envelope and 3 other letters were scattered at his feet. His eyes were shut, but his eyelids quivered as he fought for breath. His mouth gaped open, revealing only 3 teeth. Larson rushed outside. The first person she saw was Milkman Otten. She told him to go get a policeman, but he didn't move from his cart. She ran down the street to the drugstore at the corner of Broadway and 70th Street. She found patrolman Harry Singer and told him she needed an ambulance. She believed burglars had shot her employer. About a year earlier, 3 men had been arrested while trying to force their way into the house. Singer accompanied Larson back to Elwell's house. He quickly examined the body and surveyed the scene. There was no sign of a pistol. The housekeeper assured him she hadn't seen one and hadn't touched anything in the room. Singer's initial assessment? Elwell had shot himself. He went back outside and asked Otten to find a vehicle to transport Elwell. Then he asked him to come inside and help move the body. "Give me a hand with this fellow," Singer said. "He can't live very long." Otten rushed inside. The 2 men were about to lift Elwell, who was 6 feet tall and weighed about 185 pounds, when Singer noticed something. The bullet wound in Elwell's head. Then he found the shell from a .45 caliber cartridge on the floor. He decided to leave Elwell exactly where he was. This was no suicide, he realized. This was attempted murder. Singer phoned Captain Thomas F. Walsh at the police station. Walsh and half a dozen detectives arrived within minutes. An ambulance from Flowers Hospital pulled up shortly after. Elwell was admitted to Bellevue Hospital at 9:20 a.m. There was little anyone could do but make him comfortable. He died about an hour later. By the time Elwell died, the investigation was already underway. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Charles Norris arrived at the house just minutes after Elwell was taken to the hospital. He examined the room where the victim was shot. Then he returned to the morgue, where Elwell's body had been brought. Norris conducted an autopsy. The findings were clear. The bullet had entered Elwell's forehead, exited through the back of his head, and lodged in the wall behind the chair where he was sitting. According to Norris, it would be highly unusual for such a wound to be self-inflicted. Elwell was shot while sitting in the chair. He lost consciousness immediately. Based on the wound and the amount of time he survived at Bellevue Hospital, Norris concluded that he must have been shot 10 or 15 minutes before the housekeeper's arrival at about 8:35 a.m. So somewhere between 8:20 and 8:25 a.m., the gun appeared to have been held no more than 3 feet from Elwell, and judging by the position of his body, the medical examiner believed he was likely caught by surprise. Captain Walsh, senior detective at the New York Police Department, took charge of the investigation. He was immediately puzzled by one thing, the absence of a weapon, but something else was odd too. Police questioned neighbors. Nobody said they'd heard the fatal shot. Nobody saw anything unusual. 2 painters had begun working next door to Elwell's home that morning at 8 a.m. They heard nothing. Otten the milkman told police that he neither saw nor heard anything unusual that morning. He didn't see anyone near the house when he delivered milk or when he passed by a second time while delivering to the house across the street. Think about that for a moment. The room where Elwell was shot was only 8 feet from the sidewalk. How could it be that nobody heard the gun go off? Captain Walsh reasoned that perhaps the sound was muffled somehow. Despite the absence of a weapon, detectives explored the possibility that Elwell had shot himself. Grains of powder had been found embedded in his forehead and face, covering a diameter of 3 inches. Police conducted ballistics tests at headquarters. They used a Colt .45 automatic pistol to shoot at blotter paper from different distances. The cartridges were loaded with smokeless powder, similar to what killed Elwell. Investigators wanted to determine at what distance powder makes the same pattern as was found on Elwell's face. The results? The lack of powder burns suggested the muzzle of the gun was held more than a foot away from the forehead when the trigger was pulled. That ruled out suicide. Discussions with Krause and the Lewisons also indicated that Elwell had shown no signs of distress or difficulties. As Elwell's father, 82-year-old Joseph E. Elwell, told the New York Times, "The fact stands out that the pistol with which my son was killed was not found in the house, nor is there the slightest evidence that my son arose from the chair in which he was seated at the time of the shooting. Even if he were able to get out of the chair to dispose of the pistol, he could not have hidden it in such a way that it could not be found after a search so thorough as that conducted by the detectives in the last 36 hours. He was right. This was murder." Word of Elwell's death spread quickly. Within hours of his body being found, a woman arrived at his house and rushed upstairs. She wanted to remove evidence of her previous presence, items of clothing she left behind. But when she saw detectives on the second floor, she changed her mind and left immediately. By then, housekeeper Larson had already found and hidden a pink silk gown, a cap, and slippers. As she later admitted to police, she wanted to shield their owner from publicity. At noon that day, Viola Krause phoned Elwell. They'd agreed to pick up Selma Lewisone and head to her house in Elwood Park, New Jersey, to play golf that Friday afternoon and Saturday. Elwell had asked them to call regarding the pickup time. Krause was calling to say they'd pick him up at 2:30 p.m. A man answered, but it wasn't Elwell. "If you are a friend of Mr. Elwell's, you'll come here at once," the man told Krause. She was puzzled by the cryptic message. "Mr. Elwell is very, very sick," he continued, "and he needs your help right away. He wants you to come at once." When Krause and Selma Lewisone arrived, hordes of reporters were milling around the house. Detectives questioned the 2 women. They learned that they'd last seen Elwell at 1:45 a.m. in front of the New Amsterdam Theater. The question was, where had he been from then until he was found at 8:35 a.m.? Police decided they needed to retrace Elwell's steps. They canvassed taxi companies, investigating calls received between 11:30 p.m. on Thursday and 8:30 a.m. on Friday. They received several reports about where Elwell was believed to have been. According to one account, He took a taxi cab to the Montmartre restaurant on Broadway at 50th Street and was met there by two men and a woman. A different story had Elwell stepping out of a high-powered greenish-blue racing vehicle at 3:45 a.m. in front of his home. He waved goodbye to a man at the wheel, who then drove off. Police initially believed the second version was most accurate. Then taxi driver Edgar Walters came forward. He said he'd picked up a fare at about 2 a.m. They stopped at 66th Street to buy the Morning Telegraph, the New York paper that racing fans consulted. A copy of that newspaper with racing news was later found lying on the floor beside Elwell's bed. Walters and his fare then continued to 244 West 70th Street. Police concluded that Elwell had arrived home at 2:30 a.m. Viola Krause confirmed she'd phoned him at that time. So here's what they knew. Elwell arrived home around 2:30 a.m. In keeping with his usual bedtime ritual, he changed from his dress clothes into his pajamas. He took out his false teeth and removed the toupee that covered his balding head. But then police wondered, did someone else arrive at Elwell's home at 3:45 a.m., as that witness had suggested? The person driving that noisy vehicle, who dropped someone off at 3:45 a.m., never stepped forward to identify himself. Police considered the theory that Elwell had someone in his home for a few hours before his murder, but they ultimately dropped it. Why? He wasn't wearing his toupee and false teeth. He wouldn't normally allow people to see him that way. Detectives searched the house for more clues. The silk sheets on Elwell's bed hadn't been disturbed, suggesting he hadn't slept there. But it was hot that night. There were signs that he'd slept on top of the covers instead. A number of cigarette butts were found in the bedroom. This showed that he, and perhaps someone else, had been smoking there. It appeared that he came downstairs barefoot, dressed in pajamas, to pick up the mail that morning. That's when someone entered. Or perhaps Elwell had left the front door open because it was hot and he was trying to cool down the house. Police questioned neighbors again. Had anyone seen someone entering or leaving the Elwell residence after he'd returned home? Nobody had seen anything. Police were also trying to determine why Elwell had been murdered. Robbery wasn't the motive. $400 in cash and jewelry valued at more than $7,000 were found on a bed in his room on the third floor. They appeared to be exactly where he left them when he returned from Midnight Frolic. The police inspected the doors and windows. None had been tampered with. The room where he was found wasn't lavishly furnished, despite the wealth of its owner. It had 3 paintings of no value in a small wooden frame containing Rudyard Kipling's poem, If. Detectives found no signs that a racetrack feud was the motive. According to Assistant District Attorney John F. Joyce, they all say he was generous in all his dealings on the turf and had no enemies there. But here's something interesting. When Larson found Elwell, she noticed that a second chair had been moved. It was located in the middle of the room instead of in its usual place. It appeared that the murderer might have sat in it before shooting Elwell. At Elwell's left side was the letter he'd received that morning from Lloyd Gentry, his head trainer at the Latonia racetrack in Kentucky. In it, Gentry gave a brief report on the condition of a few horses and the expenses involved in maintaining the stable. There were no signs of alarm or financial difficulties. Friends and police believed the shooter was someone close to Elwell, someone he knew well, someone he was comfortable talking to. As William Barnes, Elwell's secretary and valet, told the New York Times, Mr. Elwell was murdered, and he was murdered by somebody with whom he was intimately acquainted. The slayer either entered the house with a key, which had previously been provided by Mr. Elwell, or was admitted by Mr. Elwell a few minutes before the shooting. Chauffeur Edwin Rhodes said that several women had keys to Elwell's home. They used them to come and go as they pleased. But police never found any of these women. A few months earlier, 3 men had broken in through the basement door at 3 p.m. A neighbor spotted them and phoned police. After that incident, the locks had been changed in December. According to the locksmith, only 2 sets of keys were issued, one for Elwell and one for Larson. One thing was clear. Elwell enjoyed the company of women. Police found that pink silk negligee in a closet. The tag identifying the owner had been removed. It had been carefully folded and placed in a gray, unmarked cardboard box. Larson initially claimed she'd never seen any of the women who visited Elwell. She said she didn't know the names of any of his female friends. But after being questioned further, Larson admitted that a young woman had visited him several days before the murder. She described her as short, fat, young, and pretty, with dark eyes and hair. She was wearing a gray suit with fur trim at the bottom. Larson had prepared lunch for them: chops, tomatoes, and strawberry shortcake. After the young woman spent several hours with Elwell, a taxi arrived for her. Another woman, someone Elwell had met in Palm Beach earlier, was trying to get in touch with him before the Saratoga racing season began. All of these women were questioned, but none appeared to have anything to do with Elwell's murder. Given that Elwell was a ladies' man, friends and police began to believe something else. Perhaps a wronged husband or a protective father had killed him. District Attorney Edward Swan told reporters, "There is not the slightest indication that the crime was based on gambling or any kind of money matters. It seems certain that it was committed by a man who was either instigated by a woman or who sought revenge on account of a woman." Neighborhood gossip claimed that a wronged husband had threatened Elwell's life. Investigators learned that about 10 days before he was killed in New York, Elwell had spent 2 weeks at the Latonia racetrack in Kentucky. There he'd met a woman called Anna. Detectives went to Lexington, Kentucky, after hearing that Anna's father or brother had threatened to shoot Elwell because of his affair with her. But police were unable to dig up any new leads. They returned to New York empty-handed. Police initially believed that Elwell had been shot with an Army-issue .45 caliber weapon. The cartridge found on the floor near the fireplace was sent to William Jones, a former captain in the New York Police Department who was now a firearms consultant. His conclusion: the marking Rem UMC on the cartridge was from the Remington Arms Company. If it were U.S. Army ammunition, it would have the initials of the arsenal and the date of manufacture stamped on it. Jones concluded that the cartridge was fired from one of 3 possible weapons: a Colt revolver, a Smith & Wesson revolver, or an automatic Colt pistol. The fact that the cartridge was ejected indicated the weapon was likely an automatic. Automatics eject a cartridge after every shot. He also pointed out that no silencer could be used on any of these 3 weapons. Jones suggested that a woman would be unlikely to own this type of weapon, but she could have fired it if she had some experience. Police wondered whether Viola Krause's ex-husband, Victor von Schlegel, might have been involved. After all, he'd seen his former wife in Elwell's company the night before the murder. Could jealousy be the motive? They searched his apartment in the Knickerbocker Studios. Detectives found nothing but a dusty .38 caliber Colt automatic on a shelf in a closet. It had apparently been given to him as a gift and hadn't been fired in years. Von Schlegel was then brought to the 3rd floor of Elwell's residence for questioning. Unbeknownst to him, his former wife and the Lewisohns were on the 2nd floor being interrogated by Assistant District Attorney John Joyce at the same time. Von Schlegel said that after his evening at the Ritz-Carlton, he dropped off his female companion and arrived home around midnight. His boss, Andrew Broughton, had asked him to attend the Master Car Builders Convention in Atlantic City the next day. Ironically, von Schlegel's own vehicle needed repairs before the trip. He drove his car to a garage on 58th Street between 5th and Madison Avenues to get the ignition fixed. The morning Elwell's body was discovered, Ellie Hope Anderson met von Schlegel for breakfast at his apartment. She arrived at 8 a.m. They began eating 10 minutes later. She returned to her hotel afterwards. He packed his things and went to the garage at about 9:30 a.m. His alibi checked out. Another woman dragged in for questioning was Polish Countess Sonia de Sinswaska. She and her sister Amelia Hardy had been good friends with Elwell at one time, but they hadn't seen him in more than a year. They'd been told that Elwell, a member of the American Protective League, was responsible for the Countess being detained as a suspected spy during the war. But they didn't know why he would do that. In fact, he'd successfully lobbied officials in Washington, D.C. to have her released after 2 months. After spending 16 hours interrogating people who knew Elwell, Assistant District Attorney Joyce confessed to reporters that investigators were at a loss. No clues, no motive, no possible suspect. We have not learned anything which throws any light on the case or that points in the direction of any individual, he said. All our clues lead up blind alleys, and we appear to be no nearer a solution of the mystery than when the murder first occurred. Elwell's murder generated more than front-page headlines. It generated chaos. We have had stacks of anonymous letters, said District Attorney Swan, each naming somebody against whom the writer had a grudge. I guess nearly everybody with a grudge has tried to deliver the Elwell murderer to us. All sorts of respectable people who never knew the man have been named. These letters ate up investigators' time without bringing them any closer to a solution. Then there was the man who claimed to be the killer. On April 11th, 1921, Roy Harris, also known as Benny Leonard, said that he'd murdered Elwell. His notoriety was short-lived. His wife told police that she was with her husband all day and evening at the time of Elwell's murder. Fingerprint experts took prints from tables, doorknobs, and other surfaces throughout Elwell's house. They didn't turn up any useful information. District Attorney Swan was baffled by the murder. He told reporters, "Boys, it's the mystery case of the century." Joseph Bowne Elwell was buried in Ridgewood, New Jersey's Vallot Cemetery on June 15, 1920. His killer was never caught. To this day, the murder remains unsolved. We still don't know who pulled the trigger that morning. We don't know how they got in. We don't know why nobody heard the gunshot. What we do know is this: someone entered that house on the morning of June 11, 1920. Someone Elwell likely knew. Someone he trusted enough to let see him without his toupee and false teeth. Something he never did. They sat in that chair. They talked. And then they pulled the trigger. And then they disappeared. The Elwell case remains one of New York's greatest unsolved mysteries, a perfect crime that has haunted investigators for over a century. If you have thoughts on what might have happened, leave them in the comments below. And if you want to see more cases like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel Unsolved Case. Thanks for watching.